Hello, everybody. As you've probably figured out, if you don't know me already, I'm Jeffrey Lependorf, the composer and librettist of the piece you're going to see a little bit of, and we'll have a chat about it too. I just want to give you a little context, and then I will be joined by the very superb writer Dave King, and we will perform a little bit of the libretto, sort of as if it were a play, and we'll also, of course, hear about 30 minutes of the opera, which is in fact done. This is a work in process performance because we're not directed and there are no costumes, etc. But the opera is finished, I'm happy to say. But just to give you a little context, William F. Buckley, who many of you probably know, was a beloved and equally loathed spokesperson, figurehead of the conservative right, had a show that ran for many, many years, Firing Line. He was a host for most of the years of it, I think one of the longest running hosts of a news show. It originally was on commercial television, and in fact the 4 acts or the 4 scenes of the opera are divided by what would have been commercial breaks. So that's how I ended up with 4 scenes, it's where they're commercial breaks. Each scene or act ends with a chime, 2 little chimes. When we perform a little bit of the libretto, we'll use this, because it's the best we have right here. And when you hear the one scene we'll hear, it'll end with 2 chimey chords on the piano. Okay. What I discovered recently in rewatching the debate is that the buzzer, the button that makes the chimes go, are actually in Buckley's hand, which is kind of amazing. So you'll see when Chomsky gets cut off, it's entirely Buckley doing it, which is very, very funny. You'll see scene 2 begins with, "Oh, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?" And of course he did. So in 1969, he invited Noam Chomsky on. Noam Chomsky had never been on television before. He was then largely, as he still was for many years, a professor of linguistics at MIT. Buckley was a seasoned TV pro. They're actually only 3 years apart, although I think you might think that Buckley seems much older because he's so weighty in his presence on stage, and Chomsky is clearly a bit nervous, doing his best. We'll talk about why this particular debate interested me, but I will tell you the original television episode had a title, and it was Vietnam and the Intellectuals. Imagine a TV show now, the Middle East and the Intellectuals on primetime television. Yeah, exactly. So before we go any further, and before I bring Dave out to join me, we're going to see a little bit of the original debate, so we can roll the tape.
The reason I do raise this, and I rejoice in your disposition to argue the Vietnam question, especially when I recognize what an act of self-control this must involve.
It does.
Sure.
It really does. I mean, I think that
And
this is
you're
the
doing
kind of
very well.
issue
You're
where,
doing very well.
you know, sometimes I lose my temper. Maybe not tonight.
Maybe not tonight. Because if you would, I'd smash you in the goddamn face. You say in your
Good
book,
reason for not losing my temper.
you say the war is simply an obscenity, a depraved act by weak and miserable men.
Including all of us. Including myself.
Well,
including every... That's the next sentence. Same sentence.
Sure, because you count everybody in the company of the guilty.
I think that's true in this case.
Yeah, but
See, one of the points I was
this is a sense of theological observation, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Because as somebody points out, if everybody's guilty of everything, then nobody's guilty of anything.
No, I don't.
Let's
Well,
try that.
no, I don't believe that. See, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and I think ought to be made, is that the real, at least to me, I say this elsewhere in the book, what seems to me a very, in a sense, terrifying aspect of our society and other societies is the equanimity and the detachment with which sane, reasonable, sensible people can observe such events. I think that's more terrifying than the occasional Hitler or LeMay or other that crops up. These people would not be able to operate were it not for this apathy and equanimity. And therefore I think that it's, in some sense, the sane and reasonable and tolerant people who share a very serious burden of guilt that they very easily throw on the shoulders of others who seem more extreme and more violent.
No, I agree, but surely the emotional temperature of yourself or of myself or of other people is not in and of itself an index, an automatic index to the righteousness of our emotions.
Certainly not.
It's my great pleasure now to bring out the exceptional writer of novels, essays, short stories, Dave King. Welcome, Dave. If, by the way, if out there, if you have not read the Ha-Ha, you need to immediately get a copy and read it. I believe it's true that it might become a film.
The film was delayed by the pandemic. We'll see if it happens. But it's good of you, Jeffrey, to mention it because this is about you.
Well, thank you, Dave. So we're going to read a little bit of the libretto. We'll see it up on the screen as we read. You'll see it up on the screen. We'll read from pages. And we're reading the very end of the opera. Thought it'd be fun for you to see where this thing ends up. Just to give it a little context, they had just been arguing about, even though this is a discussion overall of Vietnam, and in particular, whether or not we should supply military aid, maybe a little resonance with today, they spend most of the time actually talking about Nazi Germany and other incidents. And just before the part we're going to read, they've been arguing about American presence during the Nazi occupation of Greece. And I will say, you'll hear later that I appropriate some music by other composers. I break my using Scriabin and Haydn at one point, because I couldn't resist, where they both get tripped up before this part, saying the leader of Greece at the time, Papandreou, now I'm doing it, Papandreou, Andreas Papandreou, and they both have trouble saying it, so they end up saying Papandreou. So if you know your opera, I of course use a little bit of magic flute there, because it amused me. In any event, we're going to jump in with There Were No Outside Forces, so here we go. And I will be reading Chomsky. I'm sitting where Chomsky was.
No, you're reading.
Chomsky?
Yeah, Chomsky.
Yes,
Sorry.
I'm reading Chomsky. And Dave, I hope we'll be reading Buckley.
Apparently I'm reading Buckley.
Yeah. And notice we're seated where Chomsky and Buckley would be if this were the debate. And I have to say, now's a good time for me to thank Hudson Hall. How great are they to get us Chomsky, Buckley's swivel chairs. And a giant thank you to Tambra and Sage and Caroline and the entire team here. I've said it on this stage before, it is such an absolute joy to do things here with Hudson Hall. They invited me to apply for a New York State Council on the Arts Individual Artist Commissioning Grant under their auspices. We did, we got it. I finished the opera, so thank you as well, New York State Council on the Arts. And here we go. There were no outside forces.
But don't you realize that in your book, and that's where you're not willing to be consistent in carrying out this argument. You're constantly talking about our satellizing of places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and so on and so forth. Yet we never occupied them.
We never
in the sense
occupied
in
the
which
Dominican
you're talking
Republic.
About.
We sent 25,000 troops there in 1965.
No,
in
I'm
an
talking
occupation.
about I'm talking about.
The American Marines were in there dozens of times.
Well, all right. Look. I think you're being evasive, and I don't think you want
evasive?
to be.
No, not at all.
Let me ask you this.
I'm not being evasive at all. You know, we simply repeatedly sent troops to Nicaragua, to the Mediterranean, to Cuba, to the Dominican Republic, et cetera, et cetera.
Is it possible to satellize a nation without having an occupying army there?
Yes, it is.
All right, then there goes your your tedious French explanation.
Not at all, because that doesn't happen to be you see, we're talking about a real situation.
Yeah.
We could talk about some ideal situation and, have an academic
I'm saying,
discussion
therefore,
about it.
it is possible
The
for
real
North
situation
Vietnam
in France
to satellize South Vietnam, presumably, without even
it's
occupying
logically
it militarily
possible to,
in any formal
but it
sense.
didn't happen.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen,
Well,
though, so there's no point in discussing
This is an
it.
argument, considering in which there are 2 points of view historically.
Let's discuss it then. Yeah, in fact, you see, there's much more, if you want to be serious about it, there's more evidence that South Vietnam tried to colonize North Vietnam than conversely. In fact, South Vietnamese commandos were going, regular military forces were going north, considerably earlier than the time when we even proclaimed that the infiltration began from north to south.
Did they bump into the refugees coming south?
The refugees were coming south we're going both directions, in fact, in 1954, 55, and at least according to Bernard Fall, and the commandos began going north in 55 or 57. The first claimed infiltration from the north was in 59, and that was South Vietnamese coming south. So if one wants to talk about, again, the real world, the first emotion.
The trouble is, your difficulty, Mr. Chomsky, is in my judgment, you never know where neatly to begin your historical
you choose
sequence
the point of beginning.
Well, the point really is that if you're starting to say that 1959 was a provocation.
No, it wasn't a provocation. I definitely don't claim that a provocation begins.
The South was going north, I say. Okay, but how about the people who were going from north to south, who were talking about the misery that had been brought about by Ho Chi Minh and so forth?
When was that?
What's that?
Now, which people you're talking about, I don't know.
Well, I'm talking about the Vietnamese, north and south.
Vietnamese,
your
north
trouble,
and south?
I think, is neatly captured in the remark made recently by Czechoslovakia, that Czechoslovakia is, after all, the most neutralist country in the world, since it declines to interfere even in its own internal affairs.
I'm afraid I don't support that. See, the relevance of that remark.
What the relevance of that remark is simply that you start your line of discussion at a moment that is historically useful for you. That's what I was saying.
At its most, you picked the beginning.
The
you picked the beginning.
Is that the communist imperialists, by the use of terrorism, by deprivation and freedom, have contributed to the continuing bloodshed. And the sad thing about it is not only the bloodshed, but the fact that this seems to dispossess you of the power.
All right.
Rational
May I
observation.
say something?
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
I think that's about 5% true, and or maybe 10% true. It certainly is true.
Why do you give?
May I complete a sentence?
Sure.
It's perfectly true that there were areas of the world, in particular Eastern Europe, where Stalinist imperialism very brutally took control and still maintains control. But there are also very vast areas of the world where we were doing the same thing. And there's quite an interplay in the Cold War. You see what you just described as I believe, a mythology about the Cold War, which might have been tenable 10 years ago, but which is quite inconsistent with contemporary scholarship.
Ask a Czech.
Ask a Guatemalan. Ask a Dominican. Ask the president of the Dominican Republic. Ask a young person from South Vietnam.
Obviously,
ask a
get
Thai.
a word in if you can't distinguish between the nature of our venture in Guatemala and the nature of the Soviet Union's in Prague. Then we have a real difficulty.
But explain to me the difference.
Sorry.
Can't you take me along?
But honey, it's business. It's just a week. Be back before you know it.
Take me along if you love me. Take me along if you love me. Take me along with
I won't be a little cutie, but the office is my duty.
my heart will rise. Sweet and glorious high above a throng if you will take me along with you.
If you take your wife along on United, we'll give you up to 1/3 off her fare. Let you charge it with our credit card. And in most cities, you can even get reduced hotel rates on the weekend.
My lips will sing something jubilant, sweet and clear and strong if you will take me along with you. Fly the friendly skies of United.
The minute you walked in the joint, I could see you were a man of distinction. Hey, big spender, spend a little time with me. Join the Muriel Mile crowd. Pick one up and smoke it sometime.
Let me ask you this, if in fact your concern is to communicate your moral concern, to what extent have you spent time thinking about your techniques? I say this seriously because it is probably true that under certain circumstances the communication of one's own indignation and fury and strength is best communicated emotionally, i.e. to one's own satisfaction, right, by screaming. It becomes observable that this doesn't bring people around. Then you've got to consider the problem of communication, which is visual, which becomes a moral problem, just as you consent to argue Auschwitz or Buchenwald with somebody if there was a chance of dissipating something of this sort. No, when if you have given that problem any thought, do you? Well, how come that you end up saying, as you do in your book, that a Senator Mike Mansfield is supposed the kind of man who is the terror of our age?
Let me put that in its context as well. What I say is, I believe that, and what I say is that Senator Mansfield is an American intellectual in the best sense, a sane, reasonable, a scholarly man, the kind of man who is the terror of our age. And that's essentially what I was saying before. I think the terror of our age is the sane, responsible, serious, quiet man who watches these things unfold and doesn't react to them. I include myself in that, as I try to make clear there in the earlier statements.
Well, if put it this way, your counsel is surely a counsel of despair. If, on the one hand, you accost us with your own and yet end up despising yourself, appealing to scrupulosity for your own shortcoming, but in this makes case pretty
But really, I don't feel any relative moral superiority, and I may have failed, But I tried very hard to express that in the book. That I said somewhere in the book that if there is any tone of self-righteousness or anything like that, it's unintended and certainly undeserved. And I mean that very much. See, I mean, after all, given feelings that I have, which I've just expressed, you know, in which you perceive, I should be doing really strong things, which I don't think I am doing. So you see, there's no sense of moral superiority, and I'm not interested in simply, you know, throwing blame around or giving people marks. I think that the beginning of wisdom is, in this case, to recognize something about what we stand for in the world, what we're doing in the world. And I think when we do recognize that, we will feel an enormous sense of guilt. And I say somewhere in there that one should be very careful not to let confessions of guilt overcome the possibility of action. I say that confessions of guilt can be very good therapy, yes they can, as is well known. They're also very good preventatives to action. And I think one should be very wary of the fact that
I think we should.
And I have some remarks that
I think that your formulation of it is at least attempting to refine the apparatus of moral discrimination and talking with conclusions directly at variance with your own. Now, the reason I haven't asked you at this moment to say, you know, why are we in Vietnam in the sense of all of this, is because we've all been arguing about this for 4, 5, 6 years.
Yeah.
And the chances of our coming up with anything, especially new, are small.
Yeah, that's one of the respects in which I think that is sort of an inarguable issue, and you know, the issues which one has been over them and over them, over and over.
Yeah, but there are perhaps certain aspects of the war in Vietnam that touch especially on your thesis. And you can say and the whole nature of it. expression or instance. You refer to the heroic Vietnamese
Resistance.
to American power.
I think it's absolutely heroic.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's
Now I understand it. I understand enough about language to understand the use of heroism in that way.
if you notice, there are a few lines below where I say, or above where I say, that's quite apart from any question of politics.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
Right, yeah. Now, suppose I were to write about the heroic resistance of the Nazis to the Liberation Army. For instance, their use of torture. Their use of mass reprisals.
I don't consider that heroic. Reprisals.
But why not? That means that they were doing
Reprisals. No, I don't. That heroism doesn't.
not?
Well, then I think we do disagree on the use of the language.
Vietnam.
I'm saying that reprisals against
Have used fire weapons to destroy whole villages of children, that they have disemboweled mayors and so on and so forth, and hung them up in all that kind of stuff.
well, that's
This is a rare fantasy.
no, that is not. That's depraved. In my opinion, that's very, very marginal.
Why is it marginal?
If in fact it's marginal, that's a question of fact.
Yeah.
In fact, you know, this, it's quite I think it's the perfect unanimity about this in the people who've studied it. For example, if you look at someone like, say, Douglas Pike, you know, the American Foreign Service agent who's the chief expert on the Vietnam, on the Viet Cong, and you read his book carefully, you discover that he points out that it was in response to the American military effort that the Viet Cong turned from their attempt to build as popular support by through the organizational methods that involved giving people an actual role in organizing and controlling their own society and institutions that learn from that to physical force and reaction to the American intervention.
Well,
When you read, in fact, many examples of quotes in the book from aid documents, let's say, or from classification manuals, where people point out,
but by the same token, you can say that the Nazis turned to torture in France. In reaction to Eisenhower's landing in Normandy. The answer is a people so disposed to act, or certain kinds of people that I yearn for a recognition of this in your writings, whereas Douglas Pike, as a matter of Douglas Pike, as you know, has a certain difficulties with the fact that it is acknowledged that up to 50,000 people were individually killed by terrorists before.
when was that?
It was between 1950, 1962.
I think 9,000 is the figure that's given usually. Right. And amazing, and it's interesting to see what it was, what one really wants to point out about Viet Cong terror during the period prior to the American intervention. Then again, I think just about all commentators, Dennis Warner, Bernard, whoever you like, has agreed that, by and large, this was terror directed extremely selectively against oppressive and external village officials.
Look, the burning of Joan of Arc was selective. The burning of Joan of Arc was selective too.
But I think one
It
is...
was intended to establish a universal point. It was not.
It was intended to...
Eichmann was selective.
Well, but you see, there is a very big, I think, see if you want. Personally, I'm against all forms of terror. No question. But if you want to understand the Vietcong situation, then let's recognize a very great distinction. At least I reckon. Let's see what the point of the political terror was. See, after all, there were during that period, there were about 9 or 10,000, according to American sources. There were maybe 9 or 10,000 village officials of one sort or another, killed by the Viet Cong, largely with the support of the villages. That's what, but at the same time recall there were perhaps 160,000 Vietnamese. If we accept Bernard Fall's figures again, killed by the Saigon government and the American. This is prior to 1965. That was a very different kind of terror, both in quantity and also in its political content.
Yeah, I know. Look, it seems to me that you are attempting here to match things which are not equal.
9,000 and 160,000.
I didn't say
no,
that.
Means equal, nor is it the political point.
Well, let me repeat my answer. My point is that one presumably distinguishes between an act of terrorism, which you called depraved a moment ago, and a military action.
But what you describe, the burning of a village, is depraved.
Yeah, a military action, which is equally part of a military operation.
Which is even more depraved. For example, let me give you some examples of what I consider depraved.
Yeah.
Malcolm Brown, back in 1962 or 3, I don't remember, reported it was an A, I think an AP or EP correspondence, reported that Saigon officials were sending American Skyhawks, you know, airplanes over to Vietnamese villages to wipe them out with napalm raids in order to cover instances of graft. For example, that's, I think, depraved. Incidentally, I don't condemn that, because you see, Just to mention this matter of double standard, there are really three kinds of terror in Vietnam. There's Viet Cong terror, there's the Saigon government terror, and there's American terror. If you read what I've written, I say practically nothing about either Viet Cong terror or terror carried out by the Saigon government. Now, if one wanted to talk about that, one would have to point out that the terror carried out by the Saigon government is incredibly greater in extent and has a very different political purpose, which one could discuss, but I restrict myself to discussing American terror. Well, but one can discuss, but I, as a matter of principle almost, restrict myself to the discussion of American terror, not the terror carried out by the various sides in Vietnam. For many reasons. For one thing, because it's just qualitatively different in scale. And for another thing, because I feel that we have some responsibility for it. Same sense, you know. In the same sense, I don't talk about, I've never written about the terror carried out by both sides in Nigeria, let's say. I don't like it, obviously, but I don't see any point in my giving them good or bad marks for it. On the other hand, if we were carrying out terror, I would very definitely write about it. So there's no double standard as far as I can see, at least. Let's say I have a standard in mind. One may or may not confess.
We will explore that.
Sara Nalty, Jonathan Lawler, and Gabriele Zemaityte on piano. Thank you so much. So Dave was hearing that for the first time, and you'll judge his expression whether he loathed it or liked it.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted. I wasn't able to be here for the rehearsals because I couldn't be in Hudson. And so hearing it for the first time after watching the video several times, I was so struck, Jeffrey, by how moving it was. It was so
Thank
beautiful,
you.
and I wasn't prepared for that because the original is, fairly dry, and yet when the Chomsky character begins earnestly talking about, trying to differentiate between heroism and depravity and duty and other kinds of abstract ideas, I found myself being astonishingly touched, and particularly by, the kind of lyrical line that you
Oh, well,
that
thank you. I
created.
mean, that was a lot of what made me want to translate this political discussion, which, may not seem at first very interesting.
Yeah.
As something that might conceivably be moving, but I think it really is, particularly in reflection of, well, the other way around, as it might relate to political discussions today, which have none of this nuance,
Yeah.
regardless of who you agree with and who you don't agree with. But, what opera can do is magnify language. And my interest here really is the language. When I first stumbled upon this debate, I think I had seen a little clip of the famous "I'll punch you in the goddamn face" part. And, thought that was funny. I was curious to see the whole thing. I did not at that time have a particular interest in Vietnam or, this is 2012, or the issues of foreign aid to military operations and so forth. That wasn't my primary interest. It was that how could these two masters of discourse so fail at communicating? And the actual speech I find amazing. And so when you add music, Buckley's, let's say, wit or pomposity can become funny and is pushed even more. And Chomsky's vulnerability and real emotion in feeling the issues comes out even more than it might in his book. I should have said earlier that the reason he was on Buckley's show is that he had just published his very first political book, The New Mandarins. And so that's why he was a guest on the show, because he was seen to be a possible new figurehead of the left.
You mentioned his vulnerability, but I was also struck by his sincerity.
Yeah.
And I think that plays really nicely against Buckley's pomposity.
Oh, entirely.
And kind of aggression. And I thought our performers did just a
They were
beautiful job
amazing.
with it.
Yeah.
You
you have Buckley being almost a bully at times, but certainly cracking a lot of jokes, and they're Holocaust jokes. I mean, he's cracking jokes because he's waiting for places where he might be witty, as opposed to really arguing the issues. And so for me, the contrast is that you have Chomsky arguing the issues, being very, very specific to an almost comically, actually, although it's not, with dates. There's so many dates rattled off. No, 1959, 1956. I mean, he's very, very particular. And he's also nervous, so he gets mixed up at times, too. But he's very, very particular and calls Buckley out on being specific about even something like a year. And Buckley's looking for opportunities to, in my opinion, debate the debate.
Yeah.
He's picking on issues of language, not really the matter at hand. And Chomsky is absolutely serious. Not humorless, but serious through the entire debate. And I just found that amazing. And also purely on the level of speech, you saw probably a bit of this in the libretto, where they pause, I find just fascinating. And for me, it's sort of a gift to the composer. They don't tend to pause at commas and periods. They talk right through commas and periods, and they put breaks in very surprising places, which makes for a lot of fun in setting it to music.
And that actually goes to the first question I had prepared for you, Jeffrey. You and I have known each other for, 30 years, something like that. And but one of the things that we are both interested in is a kind of conversation between artistic genres, between music and language, between poetry and prose, between art and language, et cetera, et cetera. And part of that goes to your interest in quoting from existing composers. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit,
Sure.
both aesthetically and practically, and maybe also like What's the deal?
Why? Why on earth would I do that? So, if you didn't notice, Buckley's music is largely appropriated, certainly the piano music, not the vocal lines, but the piano music from piano sonatas of Haydn, Franz Joseph Haydn, classical composer, Papa Haydn, Mozart's teacher, who I use here to push the character of Buckley. I'm very, very, very not interested in imitating them. There are other operas, some of them terrific, that have imitated, portraying popular characters, and those can be great, but they're about imitating those characters. For me, I think a lot of folks here will be back for Giulio Cesare later in the season here, and there's Julius Caesar. None of us know what he sounded like, or really what he looked like, and so when you see a Handel opera about Julius Caesar, you're not concerned about whether that's the real Julius Caesar. It becomes the real Julius Caesar through the libretto, right? In this case, I have their actual language. And so I want to portray them through their words and also characterize them through music that can, in some ways, leave me out of it. So as much as I'm writing vocal lines, and I like to think in a bizarre way that using Haydn, and then I'll talk about Scriabin, putting them together can only sound like me because it's weird. I think by trying to remove myself and trying to be contrary to the concept of originality, I end up with something maybe original. And so then for Chomsky, who is an anarchist, but also kind of a romantic, I think, capital R, romantic, I chose Scriabin, who is maybe less well known, but he's a composer who begins in the 19th century, and then his music takes us into the 20th century. His early compositions, he's very much under the spell of Chopin. They could be mistaken for Chopin. I think even some of the music you heard here. And then some of the music you also heard here starts to move, not quite, but toward atonality. He's alive at the same time as Schoenberg. He's born earlier, but he starts to know about that kind of stuff too. So he's not writing 12-tone music, but he's writing music that pushes there being a home bass key, pitch. And so some of the music is downright atonal, not 12-tone. And so Chomsky, I think also, he's this hardcore anarchist, but also kind of sentimental in a way, but absolutely must have the facts correct.
Yeah.
And then you have Buckley being, like Haydn, grounded, witty, balanced, like classical phrasing, and very, very comfortable. And Scriabin is a little messy. Right? Long, lovely lines. So it also was fun to write long, beautiful lyric lines for Chomsky and almost poke fun a little bit of Mozartian, Haydn-esque opera vocalisms with Buckley, which you heard a little bit here. So it was for me a way of removing myself a little bit, but also getting back in there. But also to use what opera does really, really well, and in some ways also poke fun at what opera does, which is so overblown and kind of ridiculous. That's what we love about it, but opera really is ridiculous. I forgot whose quote it was, but opera is when a guy gets stabbed in the back and then instead of dying, he sings.
Yeah.
Right? That's the classic definition. So, that's deliciously ridiculous, right? And those of us who love opera love that, but also know that it's silly. So here I'm taking a discussion about Vietnam. It's a horrifying thing that's going on, and it's, again, very much like today. And what is unlike today, sadly, is that they actually have this very nuanced discussion, but they're talking about it in a very different way. As I said, I think Buckley's debating the debate and Chomsky's debating the issues, but they both actually concede the other's points at different times, which is amazing, and they also don't come to a conclusion, and they are okay with that.
And they're present to each other in a way that I think we're missing from today's general discourse.
It's incredible.
It's very touching in that way. And I have to say that I did hear the kind of romanticism of Chomsky through the Scriabin music, which I thought was really, really just so smart.
Oh, thanks.
And we should say, I think everybody knows, but we should just underline the point that Jeffrey, as a composer, composed the vocal lines on top of these pieces that were borrowed. You know, I'm going to jump ahead to another thing that we talked about discussing, and I want to just say, first of all, congratulations on the beautiful article in the Times-Union yesterday, and there's been other press today. I recommend checking out the article in the Times-Union. One of the things that you told the reporter yesterday was you described it as an anti-opera.
Right.
But presumably, since I know you, that term is a little bit tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, it has sarcasm marks around it.
But could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so in an opera, you generally have at least a love story, if not a murder, right? And nothing happens here. What they're talking about, high drama, but it's two guys in chairs. Nothing happens, and they have an inconclusive conversation. No one grows as a character. There's no journey, no personal journey happening. It's kind of flat, actually, even though they're great peaks. So in that way, it's an anti-opera. And then also that I'm appropriating the music in the way I'm doing it, and both, I hope, expressing a great love for traditional opera while I'm also poking fun at it. It does some of the things that traditional opera does, but it also doesn't do a lot of the things that traditional opera does, and I guess I'm trying at the same time to be both avant-garde and reactionary, and somehow attempt to do both at the same time. So if one just opens the score, who doesn't know me or what this opera's about, right away you see key signatures and kind of simple rhythms, and you think, oh, reactionary composer. And then you read the thing and realize no one falls in love, no one's murdered, no chorus comes in and saves the day. There aren't arias where suddenly there's a change of mind and, you know, we have a cabaletta and it gets faster and then, you know, we go off with Don Giovanni. You know, nothing like that happens. And so I have a lot of fun doing things that make it seem like they're, I hope, seem like they're arias, although there aren't. There's no repetition. You know, the main building blocks of opera, traditional opera, are recitative and aria. Recitative being heightened speech, kind of happens in real time-ish. And then you have aria where time stops. It's the magic of opera, where you can examine one emotion for a period of time. And aria could be simply translated, very simply, as song, meaning there's repetition and tunefulness. So I try to make it seem like there are arias, but of course the text keeps going. There's no repetition, unless they happen to say a word again. But time doesn't stop. This is a real conversation happening in musical real time. Of course, it takes longer than if they just spoke. So that's fun for me and a challenge. And that's where it's maybe an anti-opera.
I guess, you know, as a novelist, the term I would use would be anti-narrative.
Yeah.
But, you know, you can hit me in the face later about that one. But it felt to me watching it, you know, like a love letter to opera. You know, a kind of huge embrace of opera. And since you mentioned the aria question, there were a number of places, particularly the mention of American Terror, which I found so surprisingly touching when I was hearing it. And I thought, oh, this is where Jeffrey's going to like sort of land on that moment and do an aria. Right. And it sounded, because of the way the singer moved up, it sounded like that was coming, and then, as you say, it just moved right on in a really interesting
right, because
way.
I'm stuck with their language, so I can't say it would be great if they, you know, talked more about that. They're interrupting each other all the time. It's great fun for me when they talk at the same time, because then I have to combine Scriabin and Haydn at the same time, and that's fun. Even though the piano parts are pretty stolen from Haydn and Scriabin, they're not taken whole meal. I mean, I cut them up, and it's like movie editing.
Yeah.
So I do terrible things to them. It's actually really challenging for the accompanist, who has probably played every single one of the source pieces as solo pieces. And in fact, we had one, our first rehearsal, there was a funny moment where Gabby, who's a remarkable pianist, said, oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot I wasn't playing a solo. I'm used to playing this as a solo. So she's got to let the singers be heard, which she did beautifully. So it's also letting me work with this music I love. If I were just writing the music for this, it probably wouldn't have key signatures and might be very, very different. I should say, too, that traditional opera, what I often don't like about it is it can be overly emotive, bad acting,
Yeah.
or Park and Bark style of, when we see a bad performance of an opera. And I have great mistrust of a kind of emoting on stage. Only certain kinds of actors can pull off pure verisimilitude, and that can be great. And I love seeing a straight-ahead play if it's done really, really, really well. But I tend to mistrust people acting when you see them acting. And so I'm trying to push it to such an extreme that if it's successful, it maybe comes around to achieving an expression of true emotion through this ridiculous imitation of opera and stealing of accompaniment.
We were talking, or you were talking about in your little anti-opera riff, you were talking about how there's no character development. And one of the most striking choices I think that you made is to change the singers out for each act.
Right.
And of course, here we saw a soprano playing Buckley and a tenor playing Chomsky, and that's a creative decision. But particularly the idea that if this were being done as a full evening, those two performers might switch roles, or other actors would come in or something. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, exactly. So just how it would work, if we were doing the whole opera and we had Jonathan and Sara, you would not meet Sara until scene 2. In scene 1, Jonathan, who just sang Chomsky, would have been Buckley in scene 1. And then who's a baritone. The tenor, who would have sung Chomsky, doesn't come back until scene 3. And then similarly, everyone sings Chomsky or Buckley in each scene. So my wanting to do that was because I so didn't want to imitate them, I want to present them through their language and the music characterization. So you're used to Buckley having a certain corporeal presence, baritone, Buckley, sure, in scene 1, and then suddenly there's a commercial break, and then we come back for scene 2, and Buckley is a lyric soprano. And then in another scene, Buckley is a mezzo-soprano and Chomsky's a tenor. So that all you have to hold on to is the language and the music characterization. So Chomsky is always Scriabin-ish, and Buckley is always Haydn-esque, but otherwise you can't rely on what they look like. So it's not about imitating them. If a director wanted to have Buckley hold a pencil like a dagger, which is funny to watch, that would be okay with me, but it still would be changing singers, actors with every scene. So again, it's a way of removing, that's again a sort of anti-opera.
Yeah.
So they're characterized through their character portrayal is through their singing, not their acting.
And
but hopefully they still do that.
I think that's very beautiful and moving, because it's almost as though you're saying to the audience, come in for a kind of traditional art form, but go out with something else. Go out with some other kinds of insights, and really do listen to the music and do listen to the.
I hope that it makes you listen more carefully to the words.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying if people leave with something, what I hope they'll leave with is the nuance of the discussion, and not just, oh, I love the baritone, I love the soprano, which I hope they will too, but it's going to resonate differently in each scene. And you're forced to listen more carefully again because you've gotten used to a sound, and now it's totally different, or right is left, left is right.
Yeah. And I have to say, I'm now desperate to see the whole thing with the singers changing around. We talked about your interest in appropriating music. Mm-hmm. Can you just maybe describe how you came on this idea of appropriating a text? Yeah. I mean, obviously, that's more common in opera. Composers find a text and they
they interpret it.
They interpret it.
They don't usually use it.
Yeah. And you, when we were talking earlier, you used the word translation rather than transcription, which I think is a much more nuanced kind of concept.
Right. And in fact, the NISCA grant, for example, was actually to complete the libretto through theater. And then I also finished the opera since I got it. But you saw part of the libretto on the screen, and you saw it kind of looked like a 2-column poem. I could have sent this thing off to a transcription service in 2012, or if I were doing it now, I would run it through an AI program very simply, and I would get a nice transcription. It would have nothing that interests me. What I love is where they stumble upon their own words, where they trip up and where the pauses are. To me, someone who's not a stutterer, normally, when they do stutter, and you heard a lot of it in the musical setting, why are you stuttering? Do you not quite trust what you're saying, or is your brain rushing ahead? There are various reasons for why you might be stuttering. And then where they break, I just find gorgeous, actually, purely as something to set to music. As I said, the breaks don't tend to be commas and periods. They're just odd, the oddest places. I think we probably all really talk like that. But if this were a play, it would probably, even with those kind of breaks, it would probably break at the syntactic breaks, right? So I feel that this whole opera is a translation of the debate into opera. And as much as I spent hundreds of hours transcribing every little is it, of the talk, I feel the way that I created the libretto is really a translation. I do consider it absolutely an original piece of writing, even though every single word is transcribed from the original because of the way that it is. The talking over one another, I'm very, very careful about. I'm very, very careful about pauses. Now, once I wrote the libretto, I put the YouTube aside, and then I set it to music. Just like when we read it, we read what's there. We read the line breaks.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of ends up sounding like the original, even if we never heard it. If you've heard Buckley, you could do a Boston Brahma, drawl, but it's kind of there. And hopefully it's there because it's there in the language. Again, not the actual physical presence of the person and what their voice really sounds like. So that kind of translation just really fascinates me. And I have to say that concept of translation came to me more recently. I was never sure what to call this before, and I would say, it's an original libretto, but I wrote it by transcribing the language. And then I thought, no, it's a translation. And I'm also a reader who loves work in translation and knows that there can be multiple translations of a single work. I read War and Peace in multiple translations. It's a really different experience, and that's incredible. So this is my translation of this debate. Someone else would, I hope, have a really different one. I don't know if there'll be a bunch of operas about this, but...
of course there will.
Yeah, surely. I'm sure I've started a trend. But for years and years and years, I have been an eavesdropper. I've always listened really carefully to what people are saying, not in conversation with them, not nitpicking, but hopefully, but what other people are saying, over there. I had the experience of being a kid, I forget what age, maybe 10, and my mother and I clearly, got it from her, we're clearly eavesdropping on a conversation in back of us at a luncheonette in a mall. And we could tell that we were so into it that when they got up to pay, we both quickly said, let's get out of here. And we ended up following them into the parking lot to get the end of the story. And I have done other libretti and operas that are also, you've seen, my Tim Gunn Project One, my opera, which is based on, again, like obsessive compulsive transcription of Tim Gunn's speech, which is remarkable. One could have a character called Tim Gunn and have fun with that, but that didn't interest me. It was really about how how his character is in his language. So I'm someone, some of you may know I run a poetry organization, based on the work of John Ashbery. And, why is this musician running a poetry organization? I'm not a poet. And I think it's because I just love language, and nuances in language to me are so full of meaning. And then add what opera can do in magnifying that, and that's what interests me. Hopefully it interests others.
Yeah, and I mean, in the literary world, there's a kind of conversation occurring at the moment about the legitimacy of the translator, and I think your thoughts on this are a real contribution to that.
I hope so, yeah.
Discourse.
Yeah, translators are writers. Oh yeah, where are we?
No, I think we have time for one more. Let me ask you, in the article in the Times-Union, you talked about your art making or creativity as problem solving. I think you and I share an interest in the strategies of actually doing the work as opposed to conceptualizing the work in, grand schemes. But can you talk about the kind of the nuts and bolts of how you do it?
Yeah. So, for me, I mean, art making can be different for everyone, should be, I guess. But for me, it is a kind of, the fun of it for me, or why I want to do it, is that is a kind of problem solving, although I'll say that I think frequently the artist is the one creating the problem to then solve it. And maybe that is a way of having some control in this crazy world we're in, that I can create a ridiculous problem. I mean, you know, set this boring debate to music and use Scriabin and Haydn and make it hopefully a moving experience. That can be a ridiculous problem, but it's one that I can then work on for some time and then maybe solve. But working at it is really, really fun. But as far as how I technically did it, so I spent some time thinking about, well, I made the libretto, and then I had to think about how do I want to characterize these personages, and I decided that I would appropriate music for it as another way of sort of removing myself. The changing of the voice parts came later. I originally wrote, you know, half the opera with just a tenor and a baritone. And then I was like, no, let me do something else to distance the presence from the language and the music. And so what I really do then, and it's a funny kind of work, but for me it was very tactile. I spent hours and hours and hours playing through Scriabin and Haydn. It was fun to have an excuse to do that, like long time. And then I would begin by taking the language and sketching it out rhythmically. And then thinking about where there might be divisions. Where is one topic held for a little while? And might that be kind of like an aria? Okay, now which piece of Haydn, which piece of Scriabin might carry that, what I felt was the emotion or lack of it in that part, or the wit? And then work with it, and then to, again, make it feel like a whole, and this you can't have heard because we didn't hear the whole opera. You heard a little bit of it in this scene. Have things come back. And in fact, the whole piece, and I spent a lot of time sketching this out, and it was also fun, has a really strict key structure. And I felt like we're on the stage we're on Buckley's stage. So the structure should be kind of Haydn-esque. And then Scriabin keeps asserting itself. It doesn't fit, really.
Yeah.
But we begin and end in E flat. You know, there's all these symmetrical key structures, and I bring bits of Haydn and Scriabin back so that it feels like you know where you are, and that characters exist. You know, if you heard the soprano singing a certain piece by Haydn before, and now a baritone is singing that bit of Haydn in another scene, maybe there's a subconscious recognition, or maybe we even realize it's the same music, but different words and different lengths, and again, that cutting and splicing all the time. And, you know, I did say, there was a funny quote, and I did say it, it was an excellent interview, that I think a listener might feel a kind of whiplash, but I actually hope they don't. I hope that as diametrically opposed as the styles of Scriabin and Haydn might be, that once you get used to it a little bit, it doesn't seem so nuts that they're switching, that we are listening back and forth between these two styles. Hopefully they're sort of absorbed into Lependorf.
I could hear it, certainly, partly because I was listening for it, but I also was really impressed by the way you bridged the two styles and by the way the performers bridged the two styles.
Yeah, and that's fun too, because if it was all jump cuts,
yeah,
it would be whiplash. You know, how can one lead into the other in a language that isn't always key-based and one that is, and all the other things that are different about them, and to try to have it seem like they're both on the same stage in the same world, but very different people.
Yeah.
So that was the fun of it, and hopefully the fun of hearing it too.
Great.
And speaking of fun,
I think with that we should, well, first we need to have another hand.
Yeah, we
for
need to have our
Jeffrey
performers. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dave. Let's have our performers come back out. They were amazing. Thank you, guys. It's a lot of work to sing something brand new and perform it. I really appreciate it. And please join us for a toast at the Crush Bar back over there. Thank you so much for coming. Amazing to see this opera house so full. Thank you.